Hello everybody. I want to present here our paper Science in the Times of COVID, an alternative hypothesis. It just came out. It has been this week been published. We're in February 2022 and this work is published in Research Review number 3. Well, you can see here the credentials here on the left. It's done by me, Peter Stalinge, together with my colleagues from the Osonaba Philosophical Society, Igor Chmelinsky and Leslie Woodcock, and we're also professors in the University of the Algarve. Now the problem here in our society is that science has been sort of hijacked by politics. And that of course is not so much surprising, because at the end science in modern days, it has been paid by somebody. So who pays the piper? Then you dance to the tune of the one that's paying you. And then therefore it's very difficult to disconnect science from politics and from industry. Actually, even the European Union has in its Horizons 2020 program has something that is called knowledge-based society. Or in other words, they want to sort of monopolize science and research and make it in the benefit of entire society. Well, that is not what science is about. But then you get things like a consensus and things like this, which has no place in science whatsoever. But then these things, they happen, and then therefore we get into trouble with things like what we now have with COVID, the things that we have with the climate, and actually even with the economy. Everything starts to start tumbling down because of this. So we're going back to the basics, to the principles of what is science, and then I will show you that this is not being applied in this subject of COVID. So bear with me, it will be about 30 minutes, and I hope you will enjoy this and that it will be meaningful. So first, do we have to say what is science? Well, that is saying that basically science is using the scientific method. Well, that doesn't answer the question, because now I have the question, what is the scientific method? And this method was presented by Karl Popper, but very well described in the book of Chalmers, which is called What is this thing called science, which is a nice title. Also people like Feynman and the great scientists from earlier days, they all use this. So what is this about? It has basically 5 points, to which I added 0 point, which is normally given as implied, as self-evident, but it needs to be said. The first point, which I call number 0, is that you study the real world. And I will come back to this because it's not what's being done in the COVID science. So first we have to do a real world. We cannot do an imaginary world, because imaginary world, that is mathematics. Then you start with axioms, and you start reasoning within your virtual world based on axioms. The real world is what this science is about. It's studying the real world, and it's doing measurements and observations within this real world. So this starts then with item number 1. You do data collection, and based on this data, you do induction, reduction, and deduction until you finally come up with what we call an hypothesis. Something, an idea, a theory to describe the real world. And this you have done then based on all the data that you have available. Then the next step that you have to do is try to debunk your own hypothesis. And that means doing experiments to see where your hypothesis fails. And not where it is actually where it's correct, but where it is fails. You should go on the look for things where it fails. And then also, of course, your theory should be debunkable. There should be a way to find data that then would take your hypothesis down. And then also, point number 3, when you come up with your hypothesis, you should have removed all the other available alternative explanations for the real data. In case many hypotheses remain, then you have to use point number 4, that's Occam's razor, and that is that then the simplest model is always the best one, or is the correct one. When you have done all these parts, 1, 2, 3, 4, then and only then, when you have finished your work, then you can communicate it with your colleagues, and others can then replicate them. Maybe they have other ways they can do, they have other data collections, or maybe they have other information they can do, maybe other experiments with other technologies, and they can then try to debunk your theory. or your hypothesis. So this is what it's all about, from studying the real world until communicating with your colleagues. I have to be made some remarks. Of course, you don't have to do all these parts. You can do just part of it. For instance, we all know Linnaeus, who did a data collection, only collected data, finding all the species that were in the world. And then later other people, based on this data, could form hypotheses. Now the nice one, of course, is also Einstein, who debunked number 3, debunk alternative hypothesis. He debunked the theories of Newton, saying, no. Actually, when there will be solar eclipse, you will see that light rays from the stars, they will bend by the gravitation of the sun. So in this way, he could debunk other theories. And he could also say, if it doesn't bend the lights of the stars, then my theory is debunked. So this is nice. It must have a debunkable way. It must be possible to remove to throw down your hypothesis. If it is not possible by possible data to tear down your hypothesis, it means that your theory or your hypothesis is actually dogma or religion. So this is also, we have to be careful. If it is not possible to debunk it, then it is religion. Looking for proof of your own hypothesis, this is called affirming the consequent, and this is not science. If you're looking to prove your own truth, then you're not a scientist, then you're also just a politician looking to show that he is right. It's also not allowed to do Bayesian adjustment of the model of your hypothesis, because then, of course, you will never come to, this would violate number 2, then if you constantly are allowed to adjust your hypothesis, then actually it will never be able to debunk it, meaning it is been going back to dogma. And on top of that, then this new hypothesis you have not debunked in your earlier step. So you see what is the problem with this? If you constantly start adjusting, if new data come in and you start adjusting your theories, then you could say like, well, I'm on a learning path, but then why did you form your hypothesis while you were not ready for it yet? You were not able to say anything yet. Now, let's see how this is then applied in the real world. So before we start, I have to say then, let's use Occam's razor again. Let's use the simplest model. So we start with the idea about what is corona. What is the coronavirus before all this pandemic started? So this information that I put here is right in the beginning. I made a summary of what is a coronavirus, and this is what it gave me, this small study. So COVID-19 is a new version of a coronavirus. Coronavirus, they are from the flu family. So there's a virus from the flu family, and they give infections of the airways. So this is also the way how this virus is transmitted through the airways. So not so much by contact of objects, but more by small particles, aerosols in the airways. It's being transmitted, and then it causes infections of the lung and the airways. It is from the flu family, and the other big members of this flu family are rhinovirus and influenza. So these three, they are basically the family of flu viruses, and they cause infections of the airways. And to give you an idea, the flu season starts in week number 14. I'm talking here about the northern hemisphere. And then you could basically say that the rhinovirus is in October and December, influenza is in December and February, and then we close off the season with the corona viruses. They are March until May, and normally, or basically always, after week 17 in the northern hemisphere, it is all over and the season closes until the next season. Also, when you have an epidemic of one of them, this takes basically 10 weeks. So it goes 3 weeks, goes up exponentially, and then 7 weeks it goes slower, it goes down. So it's a non-symmetric. The total takes 10 weeks, 3 weeks up, 7 weeks down. Well, we are now 2 years into this pandemic, so there is something that is not correct. There is something that doesn't make sense in this corona business. If we are after 2 years, we're still not out of it, then there is not, what is going on is not the coronavirus. The mortality, we could also say it's about 0.13%. It depends a little bit if it's a new virus or an old virus. New viruses are a little bit more deadly. If it is more similar to the ones already known, it's a little bit lower. But on the average, it's 0.13%. And in the world, about 2 million people per year, they die from this. And this sounds like a lot of people, but don't forget we have 7 billion people living in the world. And if they all live 100 years, which is not even the case, then there would be 70 million people dying every year. And then this 2 million actually is relatively irrelevant. Of course, every death is a tragedy, but these things, they happen. And in a civilized, more civilized society where people get older, they die more of this flu-like diseases and less of other things which people die at younger age of. Now, so I want to use Occam's razor. So unless we have some new information that can debunk the idea that it's a normal coronavirus, then we must assume that it's a simple coronavirus and it would be behaving like I present here. But now we have the consensus hypothesis. This is what we are alleged what we are supposed to believe what is happening in this world, namely that this COVID-19 is not a normal coronavirus. Now I already immediately have a problem. Where do you have proof for that? How can you debunk the idea that of the Occam's razor that this is a normal coronavirus? Show me the data, because I haven't seen it yet. So we are apparently not using Occam's razor, that the simplest model is the correct one. We are trying to change it on basis on nothing, and Occam's razor tells us that this is not correct. They tell us it's very deadly. I haven't seen the data. Of course, in the beginning of a pandemic, it's always more deadly than at the end, and on the average it will be about 0.13%, and the data I have seen it's that it's 0.15%. So this one has actually also been debunked, but especially in the beginning they said it was very deadly. The deadliness is based on a model, and I want to tell you once again, basically of Ferguson, I have to notice this. So it's a model, and a model is the same as mathematics. Doesn't matter that you use your computer then to do the calculations, it's still the calculations of a mathematical model. So this is not science. This is violating idea number 0, rule number 0 of the scientific method, namely that you have to base your ideas on reality and not on a mathematical model. And the models of Ferguson are mathematics. And it's getting even worse, because then they used the simulations that they were done based on the model of Ferguson that included the very high deadliness of the virus. They then used as to make simulations, and the outcomes of the simulations they used as reality, and then say that on basis of that we have to change our behavior, the approach in our society. So that is it is what is called circular reasoning, because you put your deadliness of the virus inside your model, mathematics, and then it comes out of your model, mathematics, because you had put it in there, and then you see that as proof of your theory. But it is not correct. That's all just mathematics and creating a virtual world in which people die and not a real world. But because of this deadliness that there is no proof for, there was considered an extreme importance that everybody started speaking aligned. So in a sort of like a fascist way, that nobody could think in another way, or you were not patriotic, and that would be bad for society. So it was very important that everybody spoke with the same voice, that we have a uniform state narrative that everybody should obey. And then no alternative hypotheses were allowed to be debated. So this is then violating number 3, that you have to then talk about and discuss and debate and debunk alternative hypotheses. So basically what they did by this uniform state narrative, they basically killed science. And that is quite grave, and actually a chutzpah, to use that word, because they said that it all came from science, which it didn't. Because killing rule number 3 of science, they basically killed science and then claiming that this is science. That is a chutzpah. And then it gets even worse. Every day new data came in, they saw this as evidence of the hypothesis. Actually, even if it was contradicting, for instance, it would certainly not be deadly at all. They would say, you see how strange this coronavirus, this COVID-19 is? It's not behaving like coronavirus. So you see how strange coronavirus it is? This is Bayesian adjustments, which were not allowed. So now they violated also rule number 3. Basically, they have eliminated science and called it science. Now, to continue, then the approach of Tedros Adhanom of the World Health Organization, he said that the solution to this pandemic is that we should test. And that, of course, is actually, as we will show, actually it created the pandemic. First of all is then the observation of Kerry Mullis. Unfortunately, he already died, so he cannot speak anymore. But he said himself that PCR is not for testing. It is only for copying DNA material. If you want to do experiments in your laboratory and you need more material, you use PCR. And then what did they do, of course? They called him a populist or something like this, and they started ignoring him. He would not get any attention on any of the media channels because it was important to have a single narrative of the state. So they ignored people like Kerry Mullis, which before actually won the Nobel Prize. And then this PCR then actually is not good, but they used it anyway because we had to do test. And it gets even worse because they don't even know what is being tested. The virus has not been isolated. So this PCR test itself, how do we calibrate it? How do we know that the test works or not? Well, they use the PCR test itself for using as the golden standard for the PCR test. Meaning that if somebody is tested positive, but doesn't have symptoms of the illness, they don't say, well, probably our PCR test doesn't work. No, they said, oh, that must mean that we have asymptomatic people, which of course is also strange. So that's meaning that you're saying that you have people that are ill and not ill at the same time. You have sort of like a Schrödinger illness that can be ill. People can be ill and not ill at the same time until whatever happens. To show you what goes wrong here, now let's assume that this PCR test has 5% false positives. This can happen. No test is actually, while it is not even a test, but this test in this case could be 5% false positives and maybe also 5% false negatives. Now you could then think, like, if I'm tested with a test that is 5% false positives and I am tested positive, that then I have 95% chance of being ill with this illness. But that is what is called the Bayesian trap. There we have the same mathematician again. That is not true because the real percentage probability of you being ill depends on not only about the effectiveness of the quality of the test, but also on how many people are actually, what is the percentage of people ill in society. In the extreme case, if nobody's ill in society, even if you're tested positive, then you're not ill. So that can be that the false positive rate can be 100% of the cases that are tested positive. They can be false positives. And actually this percentage, this X, it depends also on the number of cycles you use in PCR, which is then something that the government can change at will if they want to remove or not the pandemic. So if you, for instance, if you take the CT value, the number of cycles in the test, you go and make them very high, it means that at the end everybody is tested positive, or all the specimens test positive. And if you do very few CT value, the number of cycles, then actually all the tests will wind up actually being false negative if people are ill. I hope you understand it. Now we came up with another idea. What if all the pandemic is caused actually by the testing, that we have a testing pandemic? And to show you that this is not far-fetched, in New Hampshire in 2007, or I guess this one was then in 2006, it was reported in the New York Times under the title "Faith in Quick Test Leads to Epidemic That Wasn't." There was a whooping cough epidemic at the end. They were testing, and at the end there was nobody actually had whooping cough. They created a pandemic that wasn't, just by testing. And then you have to test the contact people and so on. To show you how this works, now imagine you have a certain alpha % percentage of false positives. Imagine this is 5%, just for the sake of calculation. And then if somebody is tested positive, you have to also test all the contact person of this infected person, or this positive tested person. I have to be careful with my words. Imagine that you have to test 40 people. Now, the people that then are falsely tested positive, even if nobody's ill, is 40 times 0.05, so that would be 2 people. And of these 2 people, then you have to test all the contacts. That is then 40 times 2, that is 80 people. And of these 80 people, of course, 4 will be tested positive. And of these 4, then you have to check all the 160 contact people. And of these 160 contact people, well, you can see this series where this leads to. This has an R value, and the R value is alpha times n. And this R value, in this case that I showed you just now, is 2, meaning you get an epidemic, but not necessarily somebody ill, but just an epidemic of testing. You go absolutely testing mad. And its testing itself has an R value. So you have a pandemic of testing. You can have an exponential growth of cases without anybody sick. The testing goes pandemic. So this is what we then put in our alternative hypothesis. And if we understand this, then we should conclude that Mr. Tedros Adhanom from the World Health Organization wittingly or ignorantly created a pandemic. And then, of course, Mr. Napoleon said, don't attribute to malice that what can be attributed to ignorance. In this case, we should give Tedros Adhanom the benefit of the doubt of just being ignorant. Now, here's then our alternative hypothesis. The testing is actually something that can go viral. The testing can be proportional to the need, for instance, that you have holiday travel. So it can be directly proportional, factor beta times the number of people that need to be tested because, for instance, they go on a holiday. And I will show an example of this in a moment. Or maybe because the school season starts and all the children in school have to be tested. Or actually a normal seasonal flu, maybe not corona, or maybe even corona, that itself, people will have symptoms of some illness and they will have to be tested. So if you have, for instance, you have a rhino outbreak, they will be tested and they will be misdiagnosed and misdiagnosed as corona. And these 3 things can then be amplified by our this what I had here before. I showed you on the page before. We had the runaway testing scenario. I forgot to tell you this. So we had runaway testing scenario which can amplify this thing. In this case, our alternative hypothesis, it can be debunked. If you have a peak outside the flu or the holiday season, and then you have a peak, that means our hypothesis is wrong. And this is in contrast to the consensus hypothesis that whatever data comes in, they say that, well, you see what a strange beast it is, and they never admit that actually there was no pandemic. So the consensus hypothesis is not science because it cannot be debunked. Our alternative hypothesis is science because it can be debunked if we have a peak outside the flu or a holiday season. I will not bother you here with this image. It's just for decoration. If you're interested in how this works, this debunking, then go read our publication. Now I get here some observations. I took here on the left, you see here the data from Sweden in green and Netherlands in blue. They are 2 countries which are very similar in climate and in healthcare system and the way the country itself is organized. So they should have similar behavior. And indeed, you could see here above in the top picture, the new cases per 100 million. This is actually very similar. So there is a problem with that because they had completely different measures taken by the government to fight this pandemic. So how can this be? Apparently, drawn from this conclusion, the conclusion drawn from this figure is that the measures, they don't work. How do they explain this? In the consensus hypothesis, well, I would like to hear them, but they say like, well, this is a strange beast. Corona is, in one country, it behaves different than in the other. And you can also see here now, how can it be that you have outbreaks with and without mortality? So let me, for instance, see here. Here you have the original, look how small this peak is, the original corona wave that is in the correct month, and we will come back to that. This is the original corona, and you had a lot of death associated in Netherlands and in Sweden. In Sweden, a little bit less for some reason, but it's within the error of margin of error. And then we have some peaks caused by more testing, we say, and we have less mortality. And we have here actually this latest peak here at the end. As you can see, it has no mortality whatsoever. So how do they prove this? What is going on there? In the alternative hypothesis is not all peaks are real. And I can show here, for instance, in the Netherlands, in the travel season, we have here a huge peak, but it has no mortality whatsoever. It is flat, completely flat. And now, when the moment we submitted our manuscript, actually in the Netherlands, it was going very high. And again, now it's getting a little bit, we're going into rhino season here. And again, we have mortality. So we have that according to the consensus hypothesis, it is mutating and then mutating back. That is strange. So we have mortality, not mortality, not mortality, and mortality again. That is strange. In the alternative hypothesis, this one is real. These peaks are smaller. So we have again rhino, influenza, and corona. And this peak is completely nonsense. It's just from traveling. Also, how can it be that the influenza has disappeared? Well, in the consensus hypothesis, the measures worked against influenza, but they didn't work against corona. That is strange because they're very, very similar illnesses. So how can it be? In our alternative hypothesis, it is misdiagnosis and then possibly runaway testing scenario. How can it be that in Barcelona in 2019, in March, 1 year before the outbreak of corona, COVID-19 in Europe, in Barcelona was a positive test in the sewer system. They have the samples and they tested it. I would like to see an explanation. In our alternative hypothesis, it just means it's a false positive. And I want to show you now the data of Euromomo, which is the excess mortality in Europe. They have been monitoring it since 2017, and you can see here very nicely, you can identify, I've put them here in color, you can identify here the peaks in blue is influenza, in green is corona, and in red is rhino. So you can see here 2017 it was hit by a big wave of influenza. Then in 2018 we had a wave of influenza and then corona. In 2019 we had a wave of influenza, and then in 2020 we have here our corona peak, and then in summer we had nothing. Apart from this one, this is actually caused by heat waves. So this is what the heat is killing people. This is true, but don't forget, cold is heating even more than the heat, at least in Europe. In Europe, the heat is a very small problem. More the cold is a problem. But then, by the end of the year, the society was weakened by the governmental measures, and then we got hit by a rhino wave that was now also very much killing. And in the beginning of the year 2021, we got hit by influenza wave, and society weakened. Everybody was staying at home, not doing sports, not going outside, sitting at home at the sofa, at the couch to watch the latest news, how many cases and so on. And then we got all this the news about how many people died, and this made people even more in panic, and panicked people actually, they were dying. But as you can see, in the corona season, which was March until May, there was nobody, very few people dying. So actually we got one wave of corona in 2020 and then nothing more. It was over, it's gone. It's outside our system. Nobody's dying of corona anymore. And now by the end of 2021 we get a little bit rhino again, but this is in a little bit not too early to say how big this wave will be. So to continue, let me show you some other observations. I put here the data of Great Britain and Israel, Great Britain in black and Israel in gray. And you can see in both of them, You can see here the original, in orange, the original viral pandemic of corona, and it nicely follows the 3-7-10 weeks, 3 weeks up, 7 weeks down, more or less. It's asymmetric. But then we get, in blue, we get the testing pandemic. And look how funny it is. It is 10 weeks up and 10 weeks down. And this is independent. All the waves, all the forthcoming waves, they were identical. 10 weeks up, 10 weeks down, 10 weeks up, 10 weeks down, in Israel and in Great Britain. So the height of the peak, of course, is determined by, in our model, by how many tests capacity a country has. But the speed in which it goes is given by how many people have to be tested once a person is tested positive. So this R value is, in our case, is given by the testing runaway testing scenario. If you want to understand this in the framework of the official narrative of the government, then there is something very strange going on. Because even when we start vaccinating people, you can see here the vaccination degrees in these two countries, and you see that the dynamics of the peaks, of the waves that we are in, they didn't change at all. So how can it be? The R value of all these waves, they're equal while we have been vaccinating. And of course the R value, the new R value, should be given by the old R value times 1 minus A epsilon, in which A is the vaccination degree and in epsilon is the vaccination effectiveness. So imagine that you vaccinate everybody, or let's put it like this, imagine your vaccination is 100% effective and you have 50% of the population vaccinated, then your R value should have dropped to half, meaning that it would have dropped below 1 and the epidemic should easily be gone from society. But somehow not only did it not go away from society, but it actually was exactly equal as before, meaning that A times epsilon is 0. Given the fact that A is up to 90% here or something like this, it must mean that your vaccination effectiveness is 0. The vaccination has no effect on the outbreaks. But that in our case is because they are not viral outbreaks, they are actually just testing pandemics. Now it's actually getting even worse. I should go here. The vaccine is actually increasing the number of cases. Especially now, this one is not yet in our paper because the date was not ready yet. But if you now look today in the number of cases in Israel, it goes completely off scale here, meaning that this, if we use this formula again, that this R0 now is actually bigger than it was before. It would hint at actually that the epsilon is negative, meaning that vaccinated people, they are more prone to get infected than non-vaccinated people. Well, this is too early to say. I'm just mentioning it here. It is not in our paper. But it seems to be that the vaccine actually increases the number of cases. And that is, of course, a very dangerous conclusion it would be. I want to conclude here with these closing remarks, these two final statements. The first thing is that sometimes you hear like, well, of course, we don't have cases now anymore, but that is how nice. This is because the measures work so nicely. Our government saved us from the next waves and the number of cases is going down. Well, the two things I want to say, that if we had let it run free, it would have been 10 weeks. It would be over. Maybe it would kill more in that small interval, but in total maybe not much more than it did now. And we're now 2 years, we're already 2 years, we are in this pandemic. Not 10 weeks, but 2 years. It has completely wrecked society and people now have a lot of collateral damage. People are dying from other causes and not just from this virus. And the excess mortality is actually going up without it being associated to this COVID. And apart from this, you can never use the absence of cases as a proof that the measures worked, because this would be, of course, as I said, there is no corroborative evidence. You cannot look for proof of your model. The same way I could say that in the Second World War they were doing some ethnic cleansing, and hooray, this ethnic cleansing, it worked because these ethnic groups, they no longer, they have show no more any negative effect on our society. As you can see, and I hope that you agree that this reasoning is completely wrong, because maybe there would not have been problems at all even without this ethnic cleansing. So you see that this reasoning, it doesn't work. And I want to show you here about this FOIA request which was done in the Netherlands, to show you how our government actually is psychologically ill, because this FOIA request, which is called in Dutch Wet Openbaar Bestuurverzoek in Netherlands, they asked their own experts, what will it mean if we implement this and this measures? And the experts came back, says that it will save 100,000 kalis, and 1 kali is 1 full healthy year of life. So that's nice because people will not get infected. So 100,000 kalis will be saved, but this is compensated by costing 620,000 kalis, meaning that the net effect is 520,000 kalis. And if you divide it by 40 years of life that people more or less have still on the average have ahead of them, it means that 13,000 people were effectively murdered by the measures decided by the regime. They actually went ahead with these measures anyway, full knowing that it would cost 13,000 people their lives. And this is what, to conclude, this is what Andrzej Łobachewski, or Andrew Lobachevsky, if you want, has concluded in his book, Political Pornology. He talks about the Soviet regime, but we could easily map this on our modern society. He basically came to the conclusion that our leaders are psychopaths. And if we look at this and this FOIA request, then we must conclude this is right. And if we look at it, how society has been wrecked by these psychopaths, and they don't want to listen, they don't want to hear other narratives, they completely destroy science, and then calling it a science, this of course is a total chutzpah, and actually a dangerous tendency in society. I hope that I made here a nice presentation, and if you want to know more about it, then read this this paper that we wrote. It's in the research review, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.